It is my pleasure to introduce this next session with two intellects who are helping shape the way for the UK when it comes to inclusive and sustainable growth. First, we will hear from Michael Gove, the Secretary of State for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs. He has kindly agreed to come up and have a chat with me about his thoughts on whether the UK has the right economic system in place to help innovation thrive and whether capitalism needs an overhaul. We will, of course, be touching on Brexit as well, so hopefully I'll be putting to him some of the questions that you have in your minds, but if not, don't worry, because we will be opening up the floor to questions afterwards. You'll also be able to put your questions to my second guest, Lord Adair Turner, who is Chair of the Energy Transitions Commission and Chair of the Institute for New Economic Thinking. He'll be sharing his thoughts on the challenges of climate change for societies and cities and how energy use is impacting on them. Thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Good morning, Luisa.
Is this a welcome break from Westminster and the travails of Brexit?
Hugely welcome. It's wonderful to be surrounded by civilised people who know what they're talking about.
Can you give us all a sense of the mood behind the scenes? So obviously another pivotal step today, Theresa May in Northern Ireland. What is the mood, the morale like behind the scenes? Can you give us a personal snapshot or vignette?
Yes, I think that this is one of the most uncertain times in British politics for a long time. And that's partly because of the arithmetic in the House of Commons, not just the fact that there's a minority government that depends on another party for our majority, but also that within political parties at the moment, you have groups and subgroups that are very fluid. So within the Labour Party, obviously, you have some people who are ardent for a second referendum, others who want a softer Brexit, others who, whatever happens, don't want to be seen to have thwarted Brexit because their electorate voted for it. And then within the Conservative Party, you have people who support the Prime Minister's deal. You have those who dislike it and again want to go back to a second referendum. And then you have a group who believe that it needs to be firmed up. And there are curious cross-cutting alliances, which means that on the one hand, you sometimes find that some of the positions taken by people within your own party are uncomfortable, but also that there can be unexpected alliances and friendships across the political divide as well. So it's a very fluid time, and actually, historians would probably say you have to go back to maybe the mid-19th century or even the 18th century to find such fluidity between and within parties on big issues like this.
And what's the general morale like behind the scenes?
Well, it fluctuates. I think that you have a situation where the government has its biggest defeat, indeed the biggest defeat that any government's had in recorded parliamentary history, 230 people voting against the government on a central proposition. And then the very next day, the government wins a vote of confidence handsomely, and we all go cheering through the same lobby together. So I think that in news media, we've become increasingly used to what used to be a 24-hour cycle compressing and experiencing fluctuations in mood and attitude which are far faster than before. And I think it's just the velocity which can be disorientating in Parliament. And you can find that one day the government is written off as having been humiliated. The next day it's back riding the crest of a wave.
Yeah. A real roller coaster ride, as they say. Well, we'll park Brexit for now, but we'll come back to it. You've been on record as saying capitalism has brought both growth and progress in the past, but is not delivering now. Why do you say that?
I think there are at least two problems. The first is productivity. If you look at the trend rate of productivity across the 20th century, then certainly, and obviously now into the 21st, you can see that across the last 20 or 25 years, productivity, particularly in the advanced economies of the West, has gone down. Now, some people will say, well, that's because we're moving increasingly towards a service-based economy. And you can increase productivity in car manufacture, but how can you tell if social care or hairdressing or other services are being more productive? But actually, once you drill down into the figures, it does seem to be the case that there are a number of companies and organizations that once they reach a certain size, instead of reinvesting in the sort of technology and the sort of plant that will drive productivity further, or indeed reinvesting in their workforce, they take the money out. They take the money out in share buybacks and in dividends. In my own area, You've seen that happen with water companies post-privatization. Yes, some welcome investment in the environment, but until recently, until we took action recently, far too much time spent on financial engineering rather than real engineering. So that's one of the problems, a lack of productivity as particular companies reach a particular size and become rentiers rather than genuine innovators. The second problem is, for capitalism to work, people have to think that society is meritocratic. Everyone has got a fair shake of the stick. And one of the problems that we've had is that there have been increasing returns to those who've already got advantages, particularly over the last 10 or 15 years. So if you're really smart and you've got connections, then there are amazing opportunities. And if you've got capital, because you can draw on the bank of mum and dad, then things are okay. But if you don't have either capital or connections, then you will see the system rewarding those at the top, and you will be finding yourself moving further and further behind. So those are the two things. In a nutshell, a tendency towards monopoly, which has meant that productivity has diminished, and a tendency towards increasing rewards to an elite that mean that people think it's not a proper meritocracy.
On productivity, you've said you think of land, labour and capital, the traditional facts of productivity as defined by economists, as nature, humanity and money. That's how you put it in your mind. Sounds very idealistic.
Well, I think it's important to rethink capitalism because when it comes to land, we mustn't think of it, we can't think of it as an infinitely exploitable resource. By definition, you know, when God finished making it, it wasn't possible for us to manufacture much more of it, though the Dutch have given it a good go.
If God made it.
Yes, so there's not much new land being generated at the moment. However, within that, there are ways in which we can think of land and nature and the environment in a more sustainable way. There are ways in which we can both look at what happened in areas that used to be spoiled by industry and reclaim them for nature. And we can think of other areas which are currently not being used for homes and for the businesses of the future and reshape them. So you can simultaneously have an area like the National Forest in the Midlands, which used to be an area of coal mining and minerals extraction and is now being reshaped, obviously as a forest, as an environmental asset. And at the same time, we will be building many tens of thousands of new homes in the arc from Oxford through Milton Keynes to Cambridge, and that will require us to think about how we can use nature to complement that expansion. And I think the same applies as well when we're thinking about labour, that we shouldn't just think of it as a resource to be deployed and exploited. We should be thinking about human capital and how we can make sure that the individuals with whom we work aren't simply units of production, but are assets in a broader sense.
I know you're very passionate about our relationship with nature, so I will come back to natural capital, but going back to the issues of capitalism and whether it's working, and what needs to be done then to create the shared prosperity that will sustain capitalism over the longer term?
Well, I think that we need to be honest about the need to reform capitalism. I think that businesses sometimes are worried, for understandable reasons, when they hear politicians offer a criticism of capitalism because they think, look, we face enough pressures already. There should be people who believe in growth and human flourishing who should be on our side, but yet we get this criticism. These people are anti-business. And I think quite the opposite. If you look back at various different times in our history, not least, and I think this is the closest parallel, to America in the 1890s, when there were real threats to the model of capitalism that existed at that time from populists like William Jennings Bryan. You needed a reformer who believed in capitalism like Teddy Roosevelt to take on some of those vested interests and to unleash new animal spirits. The point's been made by my friend Ed Vaizey that if you think back then, oil was the fuel of that economy. Data is the fuel of our modern economy. In the same way as you needed a Roosevelt to take on the Standard Oils and the Rockefellers of our time, you may well need action to take on some of the big platform capitalist organizations of our time, the Facebooks, Amazons, Netflix, and Googles. And I think that there's a lot of truth in that, because we do need to ask ourselves why it is that these organizations have assumed near monopoly status in each of the areas that they occupy, and we need to have a proper conversation about how we can make sure that you don't get, I mean, there are amazing companies that have brought choice to all our lives, but at the same time, we also need to ask ourselves what we can do in order to ensure that some of the practices associated with those companies don't turn the public against capitalism and lead to the wrong type of economic answers coming up.
You say capitalism needs to be reformed. That is quite a big task. Do you actually mean an overhaul of capitalism, and how would that look? Or do you just mean that trust needs to be restored in capitalism, or it's about redefining value through sustainable investment? What do you actually mean? How would a reform of capitalism actually work?
Many, if not all of the above. I think that one of the things that we need to think about are what are the incentives that currently exist for companies to reinvest in their workforce, in innovation and in capital investment, rather than taking money out in dividends and share buybacks. That's one question. It's a complex corporate governance question. Another one is, what are the interventions that government should make in order to encourage business to do the right thing, to add social value, to operate in a more sustainable way? So how can we, for the sake of argument, reduce taxes on enterprise and on labour and increase taxes on externalities like pollution? And a third thing, I think also, is asking what are the circumstances which lead to the genuine insurgents arriving who refresh the nature of capitalism, and that it raises a big question about our education system.
So what are the three main steps that government should take, do you think?
I think corporate governance, changes to the tax system to move from taxing the wrong things to taxing the right things. And then the third thing really, I think, is thinking in a sophisticated way about infrastructure, and that means thinking about digital infrastructure, education, and then transport.
How important is innovation when thinking about a capitalism that works for everybody?
It's critical because the best way to improve productivity, the best way to ensure that we can continue to provide good things of life for everyone is through innovation. But we need to remember, of course, that, as people like Peter Thiel have pointed out, it's the natural desire of any innovator, having entered a competitive market, to then become as close to a monopoly as possible. And we also need to bear in mind that at a time when economic growth is lower than it has been, throughout most of the 20th century, then there's an incentive for companies to try to protect their market share and therefore to engage in the sort of lobbying that keeps out new entrants. So one of the things that we need to do is to be alive to the way in which some corporations lobby in order to ensure that they can create barriers to entry. And that means that you need to be very sensitive in regulation. Regulation is critically important, and the right sort of incentives are critically important, but you need to be vigilant. The two wealthiest cities in the Western world are Brussels and Washington, and they are the two cities which have the highest proportion of money spent on lobbying of any cities in the world. And there's a correlation between the amount that companies spend on trying to ensure that the system works in their interest, and the way in which that works against the innovation which will provide us with the breakthroughs that will generate well-being in the future.
So what can the government do to ensure that a system that fosters research and innovation, and especially in a climate when the UK isn't exactly the most attractive prospect, and we've seen businesses leaving already?
Yes, we have seen some businesses redeploying some of their people. We've also seen some businesses delaying investment decisions. There are a variety of reasons for that, which we can perhaps get into. But I think that there are several things. The first thing is to maintain, as I mentioned earlier, a competitive tax structure. The second thing is to have regulation that is rigorous and well enforced, but also transparent, rather than opaque and confusing and uncertain. And I think the other thing also is that we need to learn from the experience in the past of countries like America, not in the sense that America, it's a wonderful, wonderful country in all sorts of ways, but not in the sense that it's sometimes being caricatured. People sometimes caricature American success as being the consequence entirely of freebooting Texan risk-taking capitalism, and that's part of it. But it's also the case, as economists like Mariana Mazzucato have pointed out, that some of America's success has been built on significant investment in science, not least by the defense industry. So the internet was a child of DARPA. DARPA was a essentially a Pentagon-driven body with a massive investment in science. And I think one of the things that we need to think about is making sure, we have a very, very good science base in this country. Of course, there are a number of threats which it faces, but I think a priority for any government is to make sure that we have investment in pure science to an even greater extent than we do at the moment.
Mm-hmm. Let's go back to Brexit
Yes.
briefly before we wrap up. And the Urban Land Institute has recently published their Emerging Trends Europe survey 2019. I'll just put a quote to you. More than 70% of Europe's senior property professionals believe the UK's ability to attract international talent will fall following March 29th, whether it's a soft, hard or no-deal Brexit. The future doesn't look that bright, does it?
I think that it's understandable at a time when we are moving house for the greater degree of nervousness to occur.
To put it mildly.
Well, every time that we make a big decision in life, whether to move job or to move house, there are always costs, there's always friction in any movement. But we do move job or we do move house because we believe that there's a brighter future. And the British people, having voted for the option of taking back control, then there are all sorts of things that we can do. I think it's also the case that some of the, and it's a complex issue, but some of the commentary about the Brexit vote seems to suggest that the only reason that people voted to leave the European Union was somehow to restrict the entry of individuals to this country and therefore to pull up the drawbridge to new talent. Now, it's a complex area, but I do think that as a result of some of the reporting and commentary and interpretation of that result, the impression's been created that post-Brexit it will automatically be the case that Britain will be more closed to talent. Yet the truth is that London, preeminently at the moment, and I think for as far as anyone can see in the future, will be one of the most international cities in the world. You will have people who will be CEOs and senior figures in industry and in the services in London, coming from a huge variety of backgrounds, which you wouldn't quite replicate in other great European cities. And I think that is a trend that's going to continue in the future.
Are you entirely sure? Because let me just put to you another quote from that survey, Emerging Trends Europe survey. And according to most pan-European investment managers' canvass for the report, their institutional clients are nervous about their allocations to the UK going forward, despite capital and rental growth. And one of them said they just look at the UK and think it's fraught with risk.
Well, I think it's certainly the case that because there's uncertainty about what the precise outcome of the negotiations will be that are taking place over the next few weeks, if people don't know whether or not we are going to have, for the sake of argument, a particular regulatory regime or a particular set of tariffs, that generates uncertainty. But I remember, for the sake of argument, not that it's a journal that I always agree with, but I often agree with The Economist just a couple of years ago, when François Hollande was president, suggesting that France was in near-terminal decline. Then a variety of things, the election of Emmanuel Macron and so on, meant that there was a return of animal spirits there. I think that, as I say, this is the moment when, with fingers crossed and rather nervously, we see our goods being put into the back of the Pantechnicon as we get ready for the move. We worry that something might be lost or damaged on the way, but then once we're settled in our new home, then we'll feel that the journey has been worth it.
Very quickly to conclude, when you move, you normally get insurance for your goods. What's our insurance policy?
Well, I think our insurance policy is the fundamental strength and the assets of the UK economy. So whatever happens over the course of the next few months, and obviously it's my job in government to work to make it as smooth as possible, we have some of the best universities in the world, some of the most energetic startups in the world. We have, when it comes to financial and other business services, centres of excellence here. We have a well-educated and flexible workforce, and we have trustworthy institutions, which mean that in lots of recent surveys, everything from Forbes to JLL, people put the UK in the top 1 or 2 places to invest for the medium and long term. And I think that those are very, very precious assets, and that's the insurance policy for whatever happens in the course of the next few months.
Michael Gove, thank you very much indeed. You can take a seat back down in the audience and come back up in a few minutes.
Thanks.
That leads me nicely on to our next guest, who is Lord Adair Turner. As I mentioned earlier, he is chair of the Energy Transitions Committee, which is looking at how we build a low-carbon economy in conjunction with NGOs and companies like Shell and Tata. He's also chair of the Institute for New Economic Thinking, which is a New York-based non-profit think tank founded in 2009 as a result of the financial crisis. He's also, talking of the financial crisis, former chair of the Financial Services Authority, a role he took over just after the collapse of Lehman Brothers in 2008, and he has many other accomplishments as well. So please, can I introduce to you Lord Adair Turner.
Thank you very much. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure to be here. You've asked me to talk about sustainable and inclusive growth, and that's a wide topic with many aspects. We could talk about climate change, about local air pollution, about water quality, water access, about social inclusiveness, transport distances, affordability of housing. And those issues are often interrelated. But I am going to concentrate primarily on the specific issue of climate change, on which the Energy Transitions Commission, which I currently chair, is focused, while also making a few comments about how that issue relates to some issues about local air quality and transport congestion. But of course, it's obvious to some people that we no longer need to talk about climate change, because in the face of these ferocious weather conditions in Chicago, major scientific experts on climate change, such as this man, are now clear that global warming is sadly not occurring. Though I have to say, if you lived in Australia, you might have a slightly different point of view at the moment. And that illustrates the complexity of the climate, and indeed the difficulty of responsible and intelligent public debate on climate in an era of instant news and some suspicion of experts. The scientific fact is that it's quite possible, indeed some models suggest likely, that an average trend towards global warming can be combined with blasts of incredibly cold air, with the instability of what's called the polar vortex, which is driving those extreme conditions in Chicago and elsewhere, potentially being a direct impact of climate change warming. On average, it goes up, but we get very cold air in some parts of the world and ferociously warm hot air in parts of others. That's not certain, but what is certain is that a climate which is on average warmer will tend to be more volatile, simply because it is more energetic. It will tend to produce more extremes, certainly of heat, possibly of cold, and of flood and drought. And overall, I therefore think it's clear that the Paris climate objective of limiting global warming to well below 2 degrees centigrade and ideally to 1.5 degrees centigrade is a very well-founded objective. And there are very strong arguments for believing that we face a non-linearity or multiple non-linearities where every half degree we go above about 1.5, we don't just get a bit more impact on our climate systems, we get a set of accelerating impacts and the dangers of tipping points. So at the Energy Transitions Commission, which, as has been said, is a coalition. It is a global coalition of both major companies, from Shell and BP to Tata Group, Dalmia Cement in India, Envision, which is a major a Chinese wind turbine manufacturer, China Light in Power, Saint-Gobain from France, plus major NGOs such as the World Resources Institute and Rocky Mountain Institute. It's about 30 of us, and it's quite an eclectic and wide coalition. That is why we believe that we have got to achieve the Paris climate objectives. And to do that, it is clear that we have got to take the global economy to around zero net emissions by 2060. And I mean zero net emissions. I don't mean that we're doing a whole load of forest planting to offset large fossil fuel use. I mean zero. It's important to realize that at the moment we are far from that trajectory and far from the Paris climate objectives. In the Paris climate process, there are a thing called nationally determined contributions. Each country puts in a statement of what it is doing to limit emissions. Those have been a useful step forward, and there are several countries like China and India in that which have committed to reducing the increase in emissions and eventually reaching a peak. But if you add up all the NDCs which have been submitted to the Paris climate process and work out what trajectory that puts us on, it puts us on a trajectory to about 3 degrees centigrade warming by the end of this century, to temperatures which the world has not seen for 1 million years. It is therefore essential to dramatically accelerate progress towards a low-carbon economy and to achieve net zero by 2050 or 60, thereabouts. The good news, however, which we in the ETC have set out in a report which we simply call Mission Possible. The good news is that it is absolutely technologically possible to do that at a low economic cost. There is no doubt whatsoever that technically we could have by 2060 a zero carbon economy, and once we got there, it would have cost us less than 1% of global GDP to get there. But to do that, we also have to do it while delivering, and we can do this, more prosperity, which in some countries means more energy. What this exhibit shows is average energy use across the world today in gigajoules per capita. And I see some of you craning your neck, you can't see it, but let me tell you how it varies. It varies from 290 gigajoules per capita in the US to 22 gigajoules per capita in Ethiopia, an enormous range. Now, people have tried to work out if we really get good at energy efficiency, build those zero-emitting buildings by 2020, really get good at making materials in the most efficient fashion and insulating our houses, we can probably have our current modern standard of living with something like 70 or 80 gigajoules per capita. We don't need the 290 in the US or the 130 in Europe, but we almost certainly need more than the 20 in Africa and the 30 in India. So there are some countries in the world which are going to have significantly more energy delivered. So we've got to have more energy, and we've got to make it zero carbon. And that seems a daunting challenge, but it is completely doable. And we know an absolutely crucial feature of how we do that, which is electrification. The only way to get to a zero carbon economy is a massive increase in the role of electricity in our economies. At the moment, at the point of final energy demand, the energy we use from electricity is about 20 to 25% of all our final energy demand. The other stuff is gas or coal, used as gas or coal rather than used to produce electricity. That will have to go up to something like 65 or 70% by 2060 if we are to have any chance of building a zero carbon economy. Shell produces scenarios where it works out how you could possibly get to a zero carbon economy. And they produced one recently called the Sky scenario. And what you see in that scenario is a massive increase in the relative role of electricity used as electricity, and also a very significant role, which is here, in the role of hydrogen made from electricity and used as an energy carrier. And the Energy Transitions Commission has produced exactly the same conclusion. We believe that total global electricity production, which is now about 21,000 terawatt hours of electricity, will have to grow to something like 80 to 100,000 terawatt hours by mid-century, and that total hydrogen production will have to go from about 60 million tons to 400 million tons, with that hydrogen made primarily from electrolysis, if we are to be able to build a low-carbon economy. The future is an electric one, and that can be made green by taking the carbon out of electricity generation. That may involve a role from nuclear, and I am personally not in principle against nuclear, but I think it's likely that the vast majority is going to come from renewables. Because the most heartening thing over the last 10 years has been the unbelievably dramatic fall in the cost of renewables. Solar energy now costs 10% of what it did 10 years ago. Wind energy costs about 30% of what it did 10 years ago. And when I was chair, the first chair of the UK's Climate Change Committee, we produced estimates then, back in 2008, of what was going to happen to the cost of wind and solar. We knew that they were going to fall, but I have to say, I hope people have destroyed the copies of our estimates because they were so embarrassingly unoptimistic. Like most people, we just failed to see that this dramatic technological breakthrough was going to occur. Now, of course, the question is what to do when the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine. But increasingly, we can solve those problems as well as new forms of technology and flexibility provision become available. The other thing which we have seen to an extraordinary extent over the last 10 years is the dramatic fall in the price of batteries. The price of batteries now is over 80% lower than it was in 2010, and according to Bloomberg New Energy Finance, it will halve again by 2024. And some people think it will go even faster. That is going to produce a revolution of electric vehicles, but it is also going to enable us to deal with the problems of overnight storage in an electricity system when you have lots of solar, but people are switching on their air conditioning in the evening as they do in hot parts of the world. The bigger challenge is what to do about seasonal storage. And there we may need backup capabilities like producing hydrogen from electricity when it's surplus and then burning it again or turning it through fuel cells to produce electricity when we need it, or to use carbon capture and storage, or to use bioenergy. But overall, the Energy Transitions Commission is absolutely convinced that you can take intermittent renewables, wind and solar, to 85% of generation of electricity. You can deal with the final 15% in a set of storage and flexibility mechanisms, and that system within 10 or 15 years will produce 24/7 electricity when we need it at a lower cost than fossil fuels. And across the world, there is enough land in the world to support the massive increases that we require. But we are still left with two crucial issues. First, the higher the total energy requirement, and in particular the electricity requirement, the more expensive it will be to provide it and decarbonize it. And the more that we may face some land limitations, not on average across the world, because there's lots of desert space, but in some particularly densely populated areas. And that means that energy efficiency, to reduce the amount of total energy required, is vitally important. And in many cases, energy efficiency improvement may be a lower cost route of getting where we need to do than simply decarbonizing the production of energy. Secondly, there are a set of sectors which we call the harder to abate sectors, where it's not so straightforward to say, well, if only I had green electricity, game over, I've got a zero carbon economy. And those sectors are things like the production of chemicals, of cement, of steel, shipping, and aviation. Now, those are the sectors on which our latest report, Mission Possible, has focused. And once we think about these issues of energy efficiency and how to deal with these harder to abate sectors, then the role of urban design really becomes crucially important. That's not surprising given the fundamental role which urbanization will play in global development over the next 50 years. According to the United Nations, we are likely to see an increase in the global population from 7.7 billion today to 9.8 billion by 2050. But more than all of that increase is going to be urbanization. It is going to be people moving into cities for the first time, a massive role of growth of cities. And that growth is hugely intensive in demand for materials, in particular steel and cement. The reason why CO2 emissions began to grow rapidly after 2000 across the world, and then accelerated after 2008, despite the progress that some of the developed world was beginning to make, was absolutely simple. It was Chinese urbanization. Between about 2012 and 2017, China poured more concrete than America did in the whole of the 20th century. Now, Chinese urbanization is actually going to reach completion within the next 10 years or so, but how we build cities in the rest of the world is fundamental. And 4 aspects of urban design, building, are, I think, absolutely key. The first, quite closely interrelated. First, designing to support pervasive and eventually 100% transport electrification. Second, designing for overall transport efficiency. Third, improving efficiency use of buildings in their use. And fourth, reducing the carbon impact of construction via better design, reuse, and recycling in a more circular economy. First, electrification of the city. The future of the economy is electric, and the future of road transport is electric, and there is no doubt about that because of the fundamental efficiency advantage of electric engines. When you drive an internal combustion car, and even if you drive it in a nice, cautious, responsible fashion rather than in a Jeremy Clarkson fashion, 60% of the energy which you are using is going to end up as surplus heat, and only 40% as kinetic energy in the wheels. And in fact, on the average way most of us drive, those proportions are 75 and 25%. Whereas when you run an electric car, 95% of the energy is going to end up as kinetic energy. And that is a huge advantage. The internal combustion engine is inherently inefficient and inherently polluting. It produces local air quality problems, it's noisy, and it heats up our cities even when in summer we'd like them to be cooler. Essentially, in summer, on a hot day in July, what we are doing with the London transport system at the moment, with all our internal combustion engine cars, is firing up a couple of 100,000 mobile patio heaters and taking them round and round the city and being surprised that we feel a bit hot and sticky. Now, the car manufacturers have done a fantastic job at making the internal car combustion engine, which is a quite Heath Robinsonian piece of equipment, as efficient as it can possibly be, but there are absolute limits. So we need a world in which cars go electric. We need a world in which urban buses go electric, and if you were in China, that's going to happen. China, by 2025, will have every one of its 1 million urban buses electric. As for trucks and delivery vehicles, there are some issues about whether and when batteries will be good enough to deal with HGVs going down the motorways for 600 miles a day, or whether hydrogen might dominate in that sector. But either way, the engine itself will probably be electric, and we believe that the whole of short and medium distance delivery will go battery electric, and that the economics will support that far faster than most commentators realize. So the crucial issue for urban design is how do we speed this process, and that essentially means ubiquitous charging infrastructure. In London, it is said sometimes that at ground level, you are never more than about 3 meters away from a rat. I've never been sure whether that's an urban myth, but what is almost certain is that except in the middle of our parks, you're never more than about 3 meters away from an electric cable. Think about it. Every street that you wander along has an electric cable. The problem is that because we didn't design our city up front to be an electric city, we don't have a whole load of charging points above ground. So we need to design future cities to make them as electric as possible, to make them as livable as possible. But it isn't just about electrifying the city, it's also about the design of the city for better transport efficiency in total. The way that we design the cities of the future has a massive impact on the whole way the intensity of transport emissions. I'd like you to look at the comparison between, for instance, Atlanta and Barcelona. Atlanta and Barcelona have roughly the same population, about 5 million. And most people would say that they have roughly the same standard of living. But because Atlanta is spread out over a much higher area, and you can't quite see it here, it's at the bottom, the tons of CO2 from transport emissions per capita in Atlanta are about 6.9 tons, and in Barcelona are 1.2. So we need to think about the whole design of our cities in order to make them more dense, better able to support public transport, better able to support cycling, and better able to support a livable design without people having to own cars. And indeed, car ownership among younger people in the densely populated countries of the world is now declining. We also need, within this second wider issue of transport, to address the issue of urban space. The car is an extraordinary capital asset in that we hardly use it. We all own cars, and 95% of the time they just sit on the street. And they sit absorbing immensely expensive real estate. If you compared the rental value of that space, if it was available space for other purposes, versus what we charge for parking permits, it's nothing like a full economic cost. This is an enormous waste of space in the densely packed city, and a huge opportunity to free up more space to make more attractive cities, greener and easier to get around. So there are huge issues about overall urban design, both in relation to electrification and overall design of the transport system. The third issue is efficiency of buildings in use. Energy use in surface transport will naturally decrease because of the fundamental energy efficiency advantage of electric engines. But in heating and cooling, there isn't the same transformational efficiency improving technology, and across the world, air conditioning in particular is placing major demands on electricity systems. It is increasing the challenges of flexibility provision as air conditioning is switched on in the evening. And in high latitudes, the biggest challenge that we have in balancing an electricity system with lots of renewables is what to do about winter seasonal heating peaks. And that means that the issue of how we design our buildings in terms of heating insulation efficiency, either to keep them cool when we want them cool or to keep them warm when we want them cool, is also hugely important. Fourth and finally, it's vitally important to focus on the emissions resulting from the production of materials, in particular steel, cement, chemicals, and within chemicals, plastics. Those materials are used in multiple industries. The automotive industry is very important, and also obviously consumer packaging. But most of all, across all of those sectors together, those materials are used in construction. And currently, these heavy industrial material producing sectors account for about 6 gigatons of emissions, which is about 18% of the total. But unless we change direction, that will grow to something like 8 gigatons, and the percentage will grow as we take the emissions out of other sectors of the economy. The good news is that we could, at some cost, decarbonize the production, the supply side of all of those sectors. We do know how to produce steel, new primary steel, without any emissions by using, for instance, hydrogen as a direct reduction agent rather than coking coal. Cement, we can electrify the heat input or put carbon capture and storage on the process emissions. But if we simply rely on just supply-side decarbonization, we are going to increase the costs. And that is a cost which we can dramatically reduce by using these materials more efficiently. The challenge is both to use less of these materials while continuing to deliver the same economic services, and to reduce emissions via greater recycling and reuse, reducing primary production demand. In steel production, for instance, the carbon intensity of recycled steel produced in electric arc furnaces down here, and what this shows is the tons of CO2 produced per ton of steel, are at 0.4 or 0.1, depending how clean your electricity are, a small fraction of the emissions from a blast furnace producing primary steel. And actually, our long-term aim across the world should be that we don't produce any new steel, because we don't need a flow of new steel to deliver services. What we need is a stock. And in developed countries, each of us, as it were, enjoys the services of a stock of about 11 tons per capita. And eventually, our aim should be that that 11 tons just circulates round and round the economy, whether it be in the automotive sector or the construction sector, and is never thrown away. There are other parts of the world where we can't be there yet. If you looked at India, the level of stock per capita is still at about 2 tons per capita, so that is going to increase. So we will have to do primary production as well, but we should try and limit that primary production by getting really efficient in our use of both steel and, crucially, cement. In the ETC, we had a piece of work done to it for us by a consulting company called Material Economics, and they looked at what the emissions might be from cement, steel, plastics, and aluminium on the basis of current building design and recycling processes, and also the processes in the automotive sector, and how much that could be reduced, not by doing anything on the supply side, on the production side, but simply by getting more efficient in the use of materials, whether they would be cement or steel or aluminium or plastics, and increasing the reuse and recycling. And it is dramatic. It could be as much as 40% reduction across the world. We'll then have to decarbonize the rest of production, but the demand side has a huge role to play. So my overall theme to all of you in this room involved in issues of urban design, from property developers, constructors, architects, etc., is that you are going to be an increasingly important part of the story. A lot of the focus until now on building zero carbon economies has been about how do we take the carbon out of electricity production. But the good news is that we know how to do that, and it's actually much less expensive than we dared dream 10 years ago. But that is not sufficient, and increasingly our focus is going to be on everything else, and in that everything else, the role of building and urban design has an absolutely crucial role to play. Thank you very much.
What are the new innovations that investors should be looking out for, do you think?
Well, there are some very obvious innovations in the sort of technological area, which I think are probably not central to most people in this room, and I'd identify two. One is batteries and the other is electrolysis equipment. So we've had this dramatic fall in the price of batteries, and this is particularly lithium-ion batteries. But what would be a real breakthrough now is not so much further reductions in the cost, because the costs are going to come down, but increases in what's called the energy density, in how many kilowatt hours you can get out of a kilogram of battery. That's about 0.3 at the moment. It would need to be about 2 or 3, about 8, 10 times as much, before we could fly a jumbo jet across the Atlantic with a battery. But if we could even increase it 2 times, we would have a transformational effect, for instance, on the speed at which we turned long-distance trucking to electric. So that's hugely important, and there's huge amounts of money going into it. The other is electrolysis equipment. We see a world in which there will have to be a very major role for hydrogen, even if almost no cars are hydrogen cars. There's been a bit of a cul-de-sac in the hydrogen economy. Everybody thought it was all about hydrogen cars. It might not be. It might be about hydrogen trucks, about making steel from hydrogen and electrochemical processes from hydrogen. And there the crucial issue is the cost of what's called electrolysis equipment, the equipment with which you start from electricity, put it into water. Some of you may remember that as a kid, putting 2 wires flowers into a glass of water, and out came hydrogen from one side and oxygen from the other. The process of driving the cost down of that is hugely important, and these are issues of deep material science. Having said that, I think there are some absolutely crucial issues which are highly relevant to the urban design space. The issue of the efficiency of air conditioning equipment and of heat pumps, which of course are just air conditioners turned around the other way. That's all that a heat pump is. And this may have a very major role to play in dealing with our heating peaks within high latitudes.
There are some incredibly steep, tough targets to achieve. At what point do you think that government needs to toughen up on policy, on regulation, to try and have more of an impact? Because at the moment there is, I guess, more of a voluntarist approach. And at what point do certain targets and achieving them need to become compulsory? And do you have any questions for Michael Gove on that?
Well, look, we do have many compulsory targets. We do have building codes. I mean, and building regulation is an important part of it. I always regretted the fact that the UK, for reasons which I didn't really understand back in 2012, got rid of the new building commitment, zero carbon commitment, which at that stage was meant to be by 2016. And actually, I thought that was completely unnecessary. We all know that it's difficult to retrofit existing buildings for energy efficiency. But when you're building anew, the additional cost of getting to net zero in a new building is really not very high. So there is an important role in the building space for building regulation. There's also a very important role in other sectors for carbon pricing. There we do have it in the UK, and indeed the carbon price tax, which George Osborne introduced, I think not so much because of a green motivation on George's part, but because he quite wanted the revenue, has been incredibly effective at closing down our remaining coal-fired plants and shifting them over to gas. So there are a variety of different policy tools which are required. Sometimes regulation is the most effective way. If you want to get everybody to use LED light bulbs, don't try to do that by increasing the price of electricity and expecting people to sit down of an evening and to work out what the net present value of buying an LED and buying the electricity is versus to buying a halogen and buying the electricity, because they'll never do that because they're ordinary human beings, not economists. But use regulation. So different policy tools are required, but we need to keep tightening all of them.
Mr. Gove?
Well, I think that Adair makes the point that there are lots of regulations already in place. And of course, some of them can be smarter and sharper, and there are some areas where we need new regulation. But in the area that Adair talked about, the future electrification of transport, the UK was one of the first developed nations to say that we would ensure that by 2040, every new car had to be a low emissions vehicle, that no new internal combustion engine vehicles could be produced and sold in the UK. Now, subsequently, one or two other smaller nations have gone further than that, and there's a moot point about whether or not we should have a higher level of ambition. But it's also the case that when it comes to everything from air quality and the regulation of coal and wood in the UK through to the quality of our rivers and waters, there is a web of regulation that's grown up over time. But of course, as new challenges emerge, then we need to think properly about what the correct regulatory tools are in order to both meet our obligations towards the environment, but also stimulate the right sort of innovation.
Of course, we could talk more about the subject and climate change, but I do want to return to Brexit, because I have both of you up here with me, and Michael Gove, you campaigned to leave, and Lord Turner, you are a Remainer. So I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts to share. But let me prompt you. I attended the conference dinner last night at the Natural History Museum, and I was talking to some very senior leaders of global companies, and the words that I heard repeatedly, two words: sad, that they're sad that the UK is in this situation, and disaster. And I quote that word.
Well, I think the crucial thing is that we've got to take a no-deal Brexit off the table. You're repeating what you heard last night at a dinner. I happened to be on the phone to a head of one of Europe's biggest companies yesterday. And I said, he was interested in what I thought of the politics in the UK at the moment. And I said, well, the Prime Minister is still keeping the possibility of a no-deal Brexit there for leverage reasons, but I hope it's just leverage reasons. We seem to be playing a game of chicken. And he said, Adair, look, just one message. European business leaders are sad, but they're determined. And they're not going to give way. And they believe in the negotiating strategy of the European Union, and there isn't going to be a magic new deal, which is much more attractive, and they are preparing for a no-deal Brexit. And they are really sad about it, but they are not putting pressure on the French government or the German government to change Michel Barnier's approach. And it would be a disaster. I mean, my overall point of view is I would have preferred us to remain. But I think the country is split down the middle. I think if we had another referendum, it would probably produce a majority for Remain, but I fear it would only be 52-48, in which case people would say, well, why don't we have a third referendum? I think when you're split down the middle, you have to compromise. And I think the deal on the table at the moment is an okay compromise. So I would support it. But the single most important thing at the moment is just to take no deal off the table and to make that as clear as possible, because I think that would just be a disaster for the UK economy and deeply irresponsible of the government if they allowed it to happen.
Michael Gove, those comments, sad and is it a disaster?
I can understand why people who would have thought that we should remain in the European Union will inevitably regard our departure with sadness. That's the understandable emotional response. But like Adair, I think that the deal that the Prime Minister has put forward was a good deal. The House of Commons chose not to accept it and has asked us to secure some changes to it, which we're seeking to do. I hope that those changes will be enough to satisfy people, because ultimately, I'd say two other things. The first thing is that the relationship that the UK always had within the EU was an uncomfortable one. And therefore we were not ever quite as enthusiastic about the project as France, Germany, Finland or Spain. And there are deep-rooted reasons for that. And I think that we need to reach an accommodation with Europe. To go back to my earlier analogy about moving house, a 52-48 vote, as someone put it to me, is a mandate to move house but not to leave the entire neighbourhood. Yep. And I think that is a fair point. The other thing, though, that I would say is we do need to all take a step back, because there's a tendency, it's entirely understandable, for people in business to say, you bloody politicians, you've effed this up or you've mucked this up or whatever it might be. But one of the questions we have to ask is, why did people vote to leave? Why did people in America vote for Donald Trump? Why is it the case that in Italy, Matteo Salvini and the Five Star Movement won the election? Why is it that in France, even though Emmanuel Macron won, 50% of the vote in the presidential election were for parties of the extreme left or right, Front National, La France Insoumise, and so on? And so therefore, yes, there are particular challenges that Britain faces, but since 2008, the traditional model of politics in most developed countries has altered. And I think all of us should reflect on why that is, and that involves sometimes some self-analysis and self-reproach on the part of politicians. But I think it also means that for business leaders, the model that had been working right up until 2008 took a knock in a variety of ways. And of course, there are legitimate criticisms about how politicians have handled things since then. But as Adair knows, it's important for business leaders to reflect on not the role that they've played, but the changed environment in which we operate, and I know that many are.
But in light of the realities of the effect that Brexit is going to have on the UK, do you have any ounce of regret?
Well, we don't know what effect it will have. We do know that it...
Well, businesses are already leaving. For the population, we are being warned of food shortages and medicine shortages. So, you know, people are seriously worried. So... You know, there are going to be some serious consequences. Do you have any ounce of regret that you campaigned to leave?
No, I think that I'd say two things. The first is that, as Adair pointed out, a no-deal Brexit is a possibility. It's not one that the government believes in or advocates, certainly not one that I believe in or advocate, not one that was advocated during the course of the referendum by the Leave campaign. But we need to take prudent steps to deal with that scenario. But also, if it is the case that a deal broadly along the lines that the government has outlined, but refined as a result of negotiation, occurs, then I don't think that any of the scenarios that you've outlined will come to pass. More than that, I think that it's important to think in the medium to long term about what Britain's society and economy will look like. So given the choices that we have at the moment, I think Adair is right. Were we to have another referendum, I don't think that would be a good idea. I think that that would do damage to some of the institutional and political resilience that are this country's assets come what may. So I think it is too soon at this stage to say what the ultimate consequence of Brexit will be, both for economic growth and also for political stability. But whatever the eventual destination, we all have to recognise that political institutions across the Western world are under a degree of strain, and that the reasons for that were reasons that came to the surface in 2008, but had been simmering underneath well before then.
Any questions from the floor for our last few minutes? Yes, we have one here. Who's it for, please? Microphone on its way. You just say...
Mark Preston from Grosvenor. Both of your presentations rely on a long-termist approach from businesses, from government, and from people generally. I know you, Mr. Gove, to be a long-termist by nature. My organisation owns quite a lot of agricultural land, as I think you know, and we're impressed with the agriculture bill and the thinking there around the long term. And yet when you were both talking, and perhaps particularly when you were talking about the overhaul of the capitalist system and changing that, you didn't talk very much about what is really required in terms of people's long-term thinking, whether in business, where there's clearly a responsibility, or in government. And it strikes me that, particularly in Western democracies, the government system itself is inherently short-term. Can you give some comments on how you see us being able to encourage a more long-term approach, which is going to solve all of the different issues, it seems to me, that you've both raised?
I think you're absolutely right. I think that the problems that Adair so brilliantly brought to light, and some of those that I was alluding to, are problems of short-termism. So taking money out of a company now rather than reinvesting for the future is a classic example of short-termism in operation. Thinking that we can use the world's resources now without a thought to where our children and grandchildren will be is a classic example of short-termism. But there can be incentives towards long-term thinking, and that is the challenge for all governments. Some governments succumb, inevitably, of left or right, to the allure of the short term. Others make decisions for the long term. And it's a matter of trying to win the argument for some of those propositions for the long term. And I think if one looks, for example, at the arguments around energy and climate change, it has been the case that the weight of scientific evidence and then political leadership has also ensured that we have thought about the long term. And let me say, probably to the surprise of many people, including myself, someone like Ed Miliband, who introduced the Climate Change Act, was thinking about the long term. Oliver Letwin persuaded the Conservative shadow cabinet to back it in order to put aside narrow partisan advantage for the long term. So Ed and Oliver are, enlightened figures in politics. They don't always get everything right, but that's an example of it working, but it relies on both political leadership and also a degree of consensus within society that's created by effective campaigning.
I think you're absolutely right, particularly in the area of climate change, to say that the fundamental problem is how do we get long-term thinking. I mean, the way I try and sum it up is, if there were up there a benevolent deity, and if she would send angels in the night to steal 3/4 of all our fossil fuel reserves so that we only had enough left that we could safely burn the lot, I am absolutely certain that by about 2060 we would have built a zero carbon economy and that we would have hardly noticed the economic cost. Because necessity is the mother of invention, necessity is the mother of entrepreneurship and investment. We would get there. And I think it's vital we get there. And I think there's about I'm afraid, about a 30% chance that we'll get there. And if you ask me a subjective probability, I think there's a 70% probability that we will fail and that we will hand on to our children and grandchildren a really rather disruptive world. What we need to increase that 30% is as much long-termism as possible. Now, Michael is absolutely right. The UK Climate Change Act is a great example of long-termism. It went through the House, I think, by 630 for 3.
3 people voted against it.
3 people. I think we know who they are, don't we? We've got a little list. So it was an extraordinary consensus at that stage. It creates a legal environment in which we have to reduce our emissions by 80% by 2050, and I think we are highly likely now to tighten that in the review that's going forward. And that creates a very useful environment for business to know that progress in the UK is just non-negotiable. It's there and it's agreed. And we need as much as possible to get that political agreement. And what I spend a lot of my time on, I'm going to be in India next week for 3 days, China soon, is engaging with politicians, with business people, trying to get that long-term point of view. It's a mix across the world. Donald Trump going out of the Paris Climate Agreement, one would be, dreaming if one didn't think that was a bad thing. But on the other hand, there's a lot of positive things happening in India and China, and a lot of positive things happening in business. What I'm struck by is an increasing number of businesses saying that they can get to zero carbon emissions. Maersk, the biggest container shipping company in the world, has said it will be running zero carbon shipping by 2050. Dalmia Cement, you've probably never heard of them, they're one of the biggest cement companies in India, says that they will be zero carbon by 2040. Many steel companies think they can do it. So there is a combination of business commitments and political commitments are required to get there. But, we're not there yet, and we need to try and shift it as much as we can.
A yes-no answer, please, just to put to you one of the questions that have come in on the iPad. It is from Anonymous. Do you think it is possible to get US, China, Russia on board and committed to a zero-carbon economy in 60 years?
In 60 years. 60 years?
So 60 years.
60 years?
Or by...
I think China at the moment is more likely to do it than the US. China realizes... China is a technocratic society. They listen to their scientists. Those scientists are telling them that China is a very vulnerable ecology, particularly in the north, even more than the south because of water supply. And also China believes that this is a huge technological and economic opportunity for them. I mean, they are the absolute leader in electric vehicles. They're miles ahead in electric buses. They are the place where we're most likely, I am afraid, to see breakthroughs in battery technology because they've made those bets. So I'm afraid at the moment I'd have to place a higher probability on China making that commitment than the US.
America, yes. China, yes. Russia, no.
Thank you. Last question from the floor. Here at the front. Thank you. If you could tell us who your question's directed to, please.
Yes, Chris Choa from AECOM and ULI. It's directed primarily to Michael, but possibly to both. We've been paying attention in terms of sharing prosperity. You outlined corporate governance, tax policy, and infrastructure. I want to just ask you a question about narrative for the moment. It's no question, I think, for myself and probably for a lot of people in the room, that a city like London or a region like the Southeast will do very, very well, one way or another, in a globalized economy. And to a certain extent, it's very, very much the way all great city regions will be doing. What is the narrative? How do we explain the benefits for investment in these global core regions to the hinterlands that may not necessarily see their opportunities the same way? Yeah. So it's a narrative question.
It's a brilliant question. Some of you may be familiar with the economist Paul Collier, and he's written a book about the reform of capitalism, which I would recommend to everyone. A brilliant analysis and some interesting solutions. And one of the points that he makes is that there's what economists call an agglomeration effect in cities, which mean that talented people find their way there, and then because of the concentration of talent there, then the return to skills becomes even greater. They become, notwithstanding some of the property prices, they become intrinsically more marketable and better off. And there's another problem as well. If you are the sort of person who benefits from that, then it's likely to be the case that the values that you have, either those that you acquired in higher education or those that are reinforced when you're in the capital or a major city, a Barcelona for the sake of argument, will be, in broad terms, more progressive. I don't mean that in value terms, but we all know what that connotes. And people who are left behind in towns, in market towns, and it's true across the developed world, feel not just that they're left behind economically because the investment is going into the major cities, but also that those who are in the major cities condescend towards them, and that their views and values, their sense of belonging and identity are somehow thought to be atavistic and reactionary. And that is why you've seen in America that the strength of Trump has been in towns and rural areas, and his weakness obviously has been in cities and in peri-urban areas. It's also why you've seen the Gilets jaunes movement in France, as people think while Macron seeks to do the right thing in taxation terms to deal with climate change, they feel that this is an example of both condescension and also people who are economically insulated from it. And this is what I think one of the challenges that underlay the Brexit vote as well, which is the sense of disconnection that many people feel outside our university and cathedral cities and places like London. And the key question is how we can give people a sense of the value that we attach to their belonging. And some of the things, I think, have to do with thinking about the reform of local government, of the recapitalization of particular parts of our regional economies, and it also has to do with thinking about the respect that we owe to different people within our country. These are very, very difficult questions, but unless we tackle them, then the divides will only grow greater.
Lord Turner?
Well, I agree with all of that. I think the only thing I would say is I don't think it can just be a narrative issue. We've got to attack the substance of it as well, because Michael's quite right. This disconnect which is going on between these successful, dominant cities, London, but also Manchester, for instance, doing perfectly well, which agglomerate, property values go up so much that people who weren't there in the first place find it very difficult to move there. The economic future of London, Manhattan, Singapore, Hong Kong, Shanghai, Shenzhen, Beijing, this is very clear and it's quite rosy. And the challenge pretty much everywhere in the world is small and mid-sized towns, many of which have lost their economic rationale from the decline of manufacturing industry, and many of which are now being hollowed out in their sort of urban look by the collapse of the high street and the move to online retailing. And this is a very fundamental issue which I think we've got to get to grips with. And one of the things that economists have got to do is engage with these issues of economic geography. The actual physical reality of economics, which has been a somewhat marginalized area within mainstream economic theory, but is really fundamental.
Thank you so much to both of my guests. Thank you to all of you for your questions. There were loads more coming in on the iPad. I had loads more questions to ask. We could have stayed here all day. You've covered too many topics for me to be able to recap, but I have to say what stays with me is the fact that in spite of having personally moved house just 2 months ago to a house called Grove House, Mr. Gove tells me I'm moving house again. Thank you very much indeed.